we have some great investors here to talk about unicorns when they were young, like a VH1 show. And panelists all up there, don't need an introduction, but somewhat different stages from really early stage to later stage. One thing that we were all talking about was the inherent difficulty of looking at unicorns and trying to draw insights of patterns or standout attributes of a unicorn when it's a baby, a seed stage company or Series A company. So I'd love to start just with some initial thoughts from my panelists. When you look at unicorns today, are there any patterns that you see? Is there any sort of common thread of the more than 100 billion plus dollar valued companies in the market today?
I'll jump in. We actually, at Shasta Ventures, we did a study of about 30 or 40 unicorns, looking back at what did they look like at the Series A, and we found a few common traits. The one thing is it's hard to identify them early on, that's for certain, because one of the key traits is a lot of the concepts are easy to dismiss at the time you see them at the Series A. And you can think about Airbnb, where people really think about couch surfing as a big, massive business at the time, or Uber, black cars seem kind of small, or so many examples are things that didn't seem that significant at the time. But they tended to focus on a really important customer need and do that one small piece really well, and then that opened an opportunity to very significant business over the long term. So that's one thing that we noticed. A few other things are they're often going into competitive markets. So you would think they'd be going into wide open markets, changing consumer behavior dramatically, but in fact, it's often doing something much better, a behavior that people are already doing, but doing it much better, and therefore there's a huge market waiting for you when you get through. So those are two things we saw. We also have a number of other findings, but I'll just start off with those two.
Do you guys agree that, Matt, you go really early stage. Yeah. Are you looking for companies that are already going to challenge really established competitive markets, or would you say the next unicorn is in a wide open space?
That's interesting. So, one of the things that you have to think about is it can't be obvious, right? It has to be non-consensus by definition to make it not an opportunity that everybody's going to drive for and drive margin down often. And so we look for industries that are often overlooked, that are frankly more and more we're focused on. We probably get known for the social stuff, the consumer stuff, but the stuff that's really exciting for us, where we think there are going to be the most opportunities, is in the dirtiest industries possible that have just never ridden this next generation of technology and just haven't even thought about how to apply it. And so everything from law enforcement to waste management to I'm talking dirty, gross industries. We spend a lot of time focusing on there because they're just not sexy, not compelling for a lot of sort of followers to jump into until they become just massive, disruptive, scary businesses. And so
I think you're going to find all types, right? With Thumbtack, they were entering a industry where there were already established players, both older, bigger ones and newer, interesting technology ones, and you would have had a very hard time guessing at that point how successful they would be in the last few years.
Yeah, I think this kind of bridges the overlooked spaces, spaces where might be more difficult to get into. Some of these early teams tend to have very insanely good evangelists at the helm. And so if I'm looking at a unicorn today and that person is still involved, or they got them up to a certain point, they got lots of people on the team early, they have people excited about it, they have investors excited about it, in addition to sort of early staff. And if you can't be an insanely good evangelist of what you're doing, you're not going to crack into the new market that doesn't see a reason to change. You're not going to have that opportunity to be disruptive and convince people to take a risk on making some change they haven't seen a need to make yet. Chris, I'm at Intel now, formerly First Round Capital, so I was fortunate enough to see some of these unicorns very early, including Thumbtack. Wish we'd done it. And that's certainly a commonality, but I think other than that, it's very difficult to tell otherwise. Everyone wants to change the world, so how do you know who's going to make it?
So Tom, you guys go a little bit more growth stage after sort of the period that we're looking at maybe, but are all the companies still led by evangelist founders at that point, or what do you see when these companies get a little bit older?
Yeah, I think we tend to invest in companies that are still led by their founders, by majority. And, it's really hard to say what makes a great founder, but, you kind of know it when you see it. And I think really amazing founders have this way of making everybody in a room believe what they're saying, even if it hasn't come to fruition yet. Even at the Series A, when I think back to some of the best founders, we met, they pitch a big vision, and they might not even have data, but like you're all in, right? It's some art of storytelling that I think we see in a lot of these founders.
There's an interesting corollary to that. One of the things that, as Chris and I look back over the portfolio, we found that almost all of the founders that were now leading billion-dollar plus, or let's just call it hugely valuable companies in today's ecosystem, all used a specific tense when talking about the mission of their company or the vision of their company. It was always future perfect. It was always this will happen, and then when this happens, we will do X. It was never like this might happen or this could be the possibility or this might be our next step. They almost had sort of an assumption that things would progress according to a plan of execution, or that they knew directionally where they were headed with definition, and that led to a sort of both the ability to recruit, the ability to tell their narrative better, and inspire, whether it was customers or future fundraising. That future perfect tense was a common thread.
If we had 10 Series A founders right here, and they all looked you guys in the eyes and said, I'm going to be a unicorn sooner than later, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, is that what you want to hear? Is that conviction good, or can it lead to hubris?
No. That'd be like showing up on a date and the guy says, so I'm going to marry you. You're like, whoa, hello, freak.
That's not cool?
No, it's not good. What you want to hear is that someone knows how to take the next step and the next step, and they have that bigger vision. They have that we are going to change this and we believe this is going to be important. But at that very early stage, if someone maybe has their product working, maybe they have some early massive users, or maybe it's just a few test users, depending on the market, you just want to feel like, okay, they are competently going to get to the next stage. And I believe that there's enough upside opportunity or enough potential to what they're working on where it could be this. But I at least want to know they're never going to get from A to Z if they can't get to B, C, D, and E.
Yeah, I'd actually say that would be a bad thing. Like that would turn us off of this. Somebody's so focused on valuation. I'd much rather see an entrepreneurial team say, this is a customer need, we see this need, have a unique vision to that need, and we're going to solve it. And hopefully that need is something we haven't thought about yet. And it's like, whoa, we haven't even thought that way, and how could it be different today, and why are you the right ones to solve it? Figure out valuations down the road. You got to get a product market fit, you have to get customers, you have to get some element of a business model going before you should be thinking about valuations a year or two down the road.
I'm not sure those things are totally mutually exclusive. I mean, it's okay for founders to think big while going from A to B to Z, or A to B to C, but to see opportunities ahead of them and start thinking, start to kind of see the forest and what's beyond it while you're just focused on the trees.
We almost always ask sort of what do they imagine success being? What does success look like? We leave it vague enough for them to sort of offer up one of two directions. And all of those mission-driven founders almost always identify success as some version of solving or improving upon the problem that they're setting out to take on, as opposed to sort of the mercenary founders that we see out there who are focused much more on those are the ones that bring up valuation and exit and return. The mission-driven ones almost universally talk about like, we're just going to take on this next version of this problem.
That's completely true. Totally agree.
And beyond the founder, for us, the founder is part of it. But I think more often than not, we need to see something in the market that's interesting to us, and usually that's a dislocation in the market, some reason to believe now is the time for them to succeed in whatever it is they're doing, why it couldn't have happened a year ago or 5 or 10 years ago. And it's very hard to think of examples of unicorns that we've invested in where you haven't had both the great founder and some market disruption that come together. It's very hard to just start a company in an industry that has no reason to change.
Yeah, Uber's not going to work if you don't have a critical mass of smartphones with GPS. That's very accurate.
That's exactly
and identity.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a founder who's I feel comfortable naming because he's so upfront about valuation and funding, Stuart Butterfield. He's said for months, in any interview or just on Twitter if you ask him, he says, I raise money when it's favorable to the company at the best valuation that we can because, if the money's good, you take it. You're shaking your head. At the same time, your partner is going on Twitter saying Slack is the next $100 billion company.
We've invested, yeah.
Yeah, no, but my point is it good for a founder to be saying, I think we'll be a $100 billion company? Isn't it okay to want to make money and be financially successful alongside meeting a customer need?
Yeah. I don't think anybody's saying that you have to
Yeah.
be.
It's not about what's your
but there's
primary
clearly-
focus, right? Is it that I'm here because I want to make money, or is it I'm here because I want to
But
build
why,
this
why can't it be
business?
both, is
Yeah.
what I'm asking.
Yeah.
And isn't it both, effectively?
It
What
actually
drive-
can be, but
Yeah.
this is framed as Series A. So
Yeah.
Series A, companies are getting
Yeah.
off the ground, and you want to make sure that they have a real product that has a real market out there. And yes, you want that founder to be so driven, they want it to be in that elite club.
So when you look at unicorns today, at what point do you usually see them maturing to the point where that would be a real consideration beyond, that laser focus on, finding product market fit and executing on it?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's investor driven. Sometimes when money is getting thrown at these companies, it's distracting and it kind of forces the founder to, start making these big claims.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the market, right? So if you're looking at the consumer space, you tend to have, there's that jump where they're here, and all of a sudden they're up here. And if you're an investor, you look at this deal, you say, what the hell? This was priced over here just, 6 months ago, and now someone came in and this giant thing, and, did I miss something when I turned it down 6 months ago? We've all been there. Whereas I think in more of an enterprise play, you wouldn't have that experience. So, we're investors in Box, and, you didn't have that jump where from one round, like at the A, B, or B to C where it went crazy, right? There was more of a step function involved. So I think it depends on what spaces you're talking about.
Yeah, it depends. I think if I think through our portfolio, so we tend to follow the smart money around here and go Series B and later. But if I think about when we go earlier by letter in the Series B, it tends to be more consumer because it's less. If you're selling to consumers at the end of the day, whether that's a Snapchat or a Slack, right, where the consumer is the end user, you can grow really quickly. If you're selling to companies, that's more of a linear step function growth rate.
Yeah.
And, I think it's easier to predict when a company selling to other companies will become a unicorn versus a consumer company where you really have to, you see the data and you have to make that bet early enough and hope that it works out, but sometimes it doesn't.
When you guys look at some of the successful companies either in your portfolios or that you just know in the space, and then you think about what would they have looked like at Series A, or maybe you knew them at Series A, did these founders typically have more polish than others? Did they have more experience? Or, you're laughing, Matt. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely not.
Okay.
If you watch the early interviews with Zuck, he had sweat everywhere and was wearing a hoodie. And at the early stages, these are not beautiful machines, right? There's a lot of duct tape holding these things together. If anything, I think it's just people that had a visceral understanding of the solution that they were bringing to market and a faith that was going to be where they had to, and the conviction to build a team around it, whether it was co-founders or investors in the early days before there was proof points, and before they could rip the duct tape off and have it going. But in the early days, I don't think any of these things are clean operations.
Yeah,
And
I think
I'd be
they're
skeptical
not
of any
afraid
that
to
were.
break things, right? I mean, so if you, again, we talked about this a bit backstage, but if you're looking at Uber or Airbnb or even ZocDoc, a lot of these companies, they broke rules, and maybe they were explicit rules in government regulation. Maybe they were implicit rules about how something was supposed to be done, and they pissed a lot of people off when they broke those rules. And maybe they tried to get shut out, by some of the other players. But I think in both of those cases, again, it's not a smooth process when you're doing that, when you're breaking things left and right.
I think the one consistency is intensity. At least that's the word we use. There's an intensity around the mission, where they're trying to get to, and what they see the opportunity, and a drive that goes with it. But they're not all, great education backgrounds, and they're not all industry experience. In fact, in our study, 75% of the founders were untested. They had never built a company before, and they weren't coming from blue chip companies before. But they were just motivated, driven, and had a vision.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any factor there where almost the naivete can help, where you don't know all the crazy stuff that's going to happen to you, and so you don't worry about that, you're just focusing on the
I think
day-to-day?
it's one of the ingredients almost. It's
Yeah.
fresh look at
Definitely.
an industry. Hey, this can be different. Why does it have to be this way? And that, if you're coming out of industry, it's like, oh no, I know why it's not going to work. Whereas somebody new would just go for it and make it happen.
Yeah. Although it's good to have a nemesis, I think.
Oh, you want to have that partner?
Yeah, well, no, I mean a nemesis, a market nemesis. I think
Okay.
a lot of these companies, the government's your nemesis, EMC is your nemesis.
Yeah.
If you don't have a nemesis, that might be the unwritten rule to be a unicorn, you must have a market nemesis in some way.
The one combo on this question is often there's the founder who's visionary, passionate, driven, and a partner who gets stuff done. So it's important to have both, because if you're both just pure visionaries, maybe nothing gets done. If you're both focused on executing, you don't see the bigger picture. So that's what we found is that and you see it in most of the really successful companies. You see that combination.
I think also being very data driven is super important. Like as you're building this thing, and being able to like really look and see what's happening and push different buttons and pull different levers and make adjustments along the way. It's just absolutely crucial.
And there's a difference between great founders and founders who become the CEO of either a multi-billion-dollar public company, because there is a set of founders, right, who are fantastic at that stage where they get the company up and running, and whether it's to 2 million of revenue or 20 million of revenue, that's where they take the company either voluntarily or involuntarily move on, right? And that's okay. Not every founder needs to be the CEO or wants to be the CEO of a public company.
Do you guys find that some of the healthier or sort of even stronger of the companies that are in this 100+ unicorn club, that it's often still a founder in charge, or is there probably no relationship between those two? Because I'm curious then, when we go back to the Series A, if you look at people and say, this is someone who's going to take this all the way to the end, or if that's not a top priority.
I think to Todd's point, it's often people who have a great partner on their senior team. It's whether you're gracious and you call it, it's your thought partner, or your COO, or whatever you want to label it, but they do have that someone who either has done it before or can do the execution, because it is very difficult to be someone who has that granular focus of nuts and bolts, and that person that keeps everyone excited and evangelizes with intensity.
Yeah, I think the data would show not just the recent unicorns, but over time, they're really great companies. The founder still has a critical role in the company all the way through. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, that generation, and then the current generation. Yeah. Absolutely true. It's pretty rare that you have a hired team in at that, let's say that $700 billion valuation stage. It's usually still driven by a lot of...
And that is the hardest thing to find there, are those guys that not only have the vision, but can execute all the way through and still still be there that many years later.
I'm curious what you guys would filter for on that individual when they're starting out, like 7 years, 10 years prior to having that experience. How would you filter for that at the early stages, at A? If that's part of this panel, right, is like understanding.
Super driven, super data-oriented, intense, smart, and intellectually honest. I think it's super important. You can't lie to us or yourself. You have to really base everything you're doing on facts.
The other word I'd add, those are really good ones, would be being able to iterate with the data, because very few of these companies actually go down the path they set out to go down. They're often making a lot of changes along the way, sometimes very dramatic changes, sometimes they're subtle. But being able to take the data and iterate and then hire the team and listen to the market as to where to go.
Yeah, it's the team isn't Batman and Robin, it's more like James Bond and Q. Yeah. Right?
Okay, well, I'd be fine being Q, personally. I think Q's the glue holding the whole movie together.
It really is.
But, so we're at post-seed. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot today about trends with more seed investment, how that translates to the Series A. If we have any early stage founders here, I'm curious, do you guys feel like getting noticed, let's say early on, and tapped as a company with this kind of outsized potential is critical to your success? Or if you don't necessarily have this discussion around you, is that okay too? Like when a company gets to IVP, where they buzzed about as a future unicorn, anyone have thoughts there?
Sure, I'll start out.
He did call you out.
Yeah. So sometimes companies have a lot of buzz from very early on. I think from pretty early on, for instance, Twitter, right? Because of by nature of who was using the platform early, VCs and technologists were in love with it. But there's plenty of great businesses out there that we've invested and exited that nobody in this room has heard of. And so there's consumer-facing companies, and there's companies that are much deeper in the stack. And I think, at least for our style of venture, it doesn't matter if you're running a great business. That's great. It doesn't need to be something that's necessarily a huge brand or sexy.
Yeah.
In about 30 seconds, we do have mics on the side. We have time for a couple questions from the audience down here. If anyone wants to ask these panelists, we have so many, and they're so much smarter than me. So would love any help if you guys do. Otherwise, I'll keep asking or Matt will just interrupt me. One question, though, I do have is so, we're in a world where there are a lot of blogs, there's a lot of ways to get coverage at, let's say, the Series A level. How much is expressing yourself to the market, to the public, important to kind of, get along that track that we're talking about?
There's no question it's a tool that entrepreneurs now have in their toolkit, right? We spend a lot of time with our entrepreneurs. I think one of the things that's happened in the last maybe 5-10 years is that you have a whole generation that don't have to have MBAs to build these companies. You can be an engineer-driven company. And with that, a little bit of the sort of the artistry of narrative has sort of fallen away, I think, from the early stages especially. A lot of entrepreneurs in the very beginning, we see a lot of pitches. Telling their own story is often a challenge. And how do you package that narrative for the Series A or for press or for customers or for your hire is something that we spend a lot of time focused on. I think if you're not spending time taking advantage of building your brand, it's not just like to build hype, it's specifically to tell your story in a way that's packageable for whoever your audience is, customer, investor, hire. We care a lot about that. And I think if you're just relying on the metrics and not thinking about the storytelling, you're blowing it.
Right. And I think to your point, I don't care if someone has a great blog. I care much more that they are in a position to use lots of other megaphones than they have one that they use effectively. I'd rather they were good at using the TechCrunch megaphone and the VentureBeat megaphone and the
Their
Journal.
investors megaphone.
Yeah, like use all of those other platforms around you. And if you're great at cultivating those relationships and evangelizing to those people and getting them excited to tell stories about you, being interesting in ways that are meaningful, that's much more important than did you have this way to do it from the little tiny Series A platform you might have built. Yeah.
Of the current unicorn vintage, if you will, do you think that when they were younger, let's say 5 years ago, was that profoundly different, or is there any other sort of trend in the community that you would say is majorly different from sort of when they would have been at this level versus an early stage company in the current market?
Oh, it's very different today. we didn't even talk about this before because there weren't billion-dollar valuations, in our in the sites, if you will. So if we're going back 5 years, it's very different, very much more focused about building the business. But there are companies that have unnatural momentum, and it's from the founder, it's from the buzz, it's from whether it's the blogs or the coverage. But some teams just have a way to get this momentum, and where it helps you the most is in hiring people. I think that's a thing that we're at the Series A. It's like you can bring people in that other teams might not be able to get, and I think that's a very valuable thing.
And future rounds of financing too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you guys worry that talent is more spread out today, where if you have a lot of promising Series A companies, there just aren't as many good sort of mid-level people to go around to help them get to a late stage?
I mean, it's certainly a problem in San Francisco.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great companies, and there's only so many people here.
So what can you guys do as, one of the big thing investors do is help with hiring. How do you address that crunch right now?
No, it's something we spend a ton of time on, is helping our companies recruit well, whether it's here or elsewhere. And set yourself apart somehow so that the people that are looking at various opportunities really want to be there for X, Y, and Z reasons.
If you guys have a favorite unicorn or any company that you think is a good example, I'm curious, is there any, as you were thinking about coming out here, is there any kind of lesson or rough around the edges thing that you would say companies should not worry about, or they should just keep in mind as they execute to get to a later success? I'm trying to say unicorn as few times as possible.
I know, we got a baker's dozen in that sentence. What should they not worry about?
Is there anything that you would say, look at an Airbnb or another of these companies, they might not have been perfect, or they might have screwed up early on, and look, it didn't matter, or a positive that people should take away from their success?
Competition. We're not gilded, perfect companies from the beginning. I think that's the main thing. They're trying to find a solution for a customer need and working their way through and taking the data and iterating. And
that's the biggest thing.
They're not. Very few of these companies went down the path they expected.
So they're data hungry early on.
Smart, iterative teams going after markets that matter. That would be
cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, panel. I really appreciate the insights. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.